Hello and welcome again to Cherry Red TV. I'm Iain McNay and my guest today is John Leckie. And John is going to be part of our series My Adventures in Music, where we interview integral people in the music business and we talk about their careers, about their highs and maybe their lows. And there's some interesting stories, but also hopefully some advice about how, if you really want to make something of your life, you can pick up a few tips. So John has produced many seminal albums, including Stone Roses' first album, The Verve, Ride, Cast, Coolest Shaker, several Simple Minds albums, a few Fall albums, a few Be-Bop, DeLuxe and Bill Nelson albums, XTC, the first two Muse albums, and I've just taken a selection from the list here. There's a lot of other great albums he's produced. So John, let's kind of start at the beginning. When you were kind of teenager, you got a job, I think, when you were 19 at Abbey Road Studios as a tape operator.
That's right, yeah, that's right. I came from college. I actually did a film and TV course in college, and I wrote a thesis on electronic music, which in 1967-68 was quite a new thing. So I would be going around record shops taking notes about Stockhausen and electronic music, and that's what I wrote up for my college thesis. And I worked in a film company for 6 months or so, and I thought, well, this is no good. I'm not going to be a film director or something. So I wrote letters to all the studios, and at that time there was only a few studios in London. There was Decca and Abbey Road. They were all tied to the record companies. And Abbey Road gave me the interview and gave me the job, and for which I'm eternally grateful, of course. Yeah. And the job was a tape operator. It wasn't like making tea or something. It was actually operating the tapes on sessions. So you would sit at the back of the studio, away from where all the action was at the front. You wouldn't really set up microphones or do anything. Your real job was to operate the tape. Which was a responsible thing because no one else touched it, and you had to slowly learn the song, learn the relationship of the people in the room, who was giving the orders and who was controlling the session, and you always had to be one step ahead of what was going on. So it was a great learning thing for me, a great learning curve, because also at Abbey Road I'm really grateful because you did many different types of music. You know, it wasn't just pop music. There was classical music, middle of the road type. I mean, I did sessions with Ken Dodd, Benny Hill, and George Harrison and John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And I joined just as the Beatles had split up, so I was kind of there in the solo records, really, the solo albums.
Were you ambitious when you got there, when you started a job at 19, 20 years old? Were you thinking, I want to be a top record producer?
I don't think the ambition was to be a record producer, because I didn't really know what that was. Okay. You know, my ambition, I think, was to be an engineer, to work the equipment. Because in those days, it's funny, because in those days, with all the big equipment, it was like a spaceship, you know. And I always thought, well, you know, when I looked in there and saw the first recording studio with all those knobs and flashing lights, I thought, wow, this is like a spaceship, you know. Yeah. And of course, in 1968, that meant man on the moon. You know, I thought, well, this is the closest I'm going to get to travel in a spaceship, and that was the recording studio, you know. So yeah, my ambition was to be a spaceman rather than a producer.
Great ambition, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny because I'm not really a musician, so I went to lots of gigs when I was a teenager. I mean, I saw all the great bands and things from when I was 14, really. I mean, I saw the Stones and all sorts of people like the Stones and the Yardbirds on my 14th birthday in Kilburn. So I was always at gigs 3-4 times a week. But I never really hung out with musicians. I never really I never sat in my bedroom learning guitar. But here I was in this, probably at the time, it was a recording studio. I didn't know it was the best studio in the world, but, you know, here I was as close as what you are to me watching George Harrison play, or all these incredible people.
So the amazing thing is that within 2 years you worked with all the Beatles, because you worked with George Harrison, All Things Must Pass, you worked with John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band, you worked with Paul McCartney when he was in Wings, and you did something with Ringo as well, didn't you?
That's right, yeah.
So that they had been the biggest band in the world. You worked with them all as tape operators, so you got to at least meet them.
In the room with them, yeah.
But you told me on the phone you didn't like the Beatles very much.
Well, I like the Beatles, but at that age, the Beatles weren't very hip in 1970. I mean, there was so many different types of music, and people were expanded in their taste of music. I mean, at the time I was into Zappa and what you might call avant-garde music, you know, electronic music in a big way. We'd sit up all night listening to Stockhausen and Luciano Berio and different modern things. And the Beatles were kind of pop and a bit twee, and, you know, I mean, later they went on to other things. But I was reluctant to tell my friends in Portobello Road, where we all lived in a house, you know, that I was working with the Beatles, you know.
I find that so hard to believe.
We were so hip.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, All Things Must Pass, George Harrison, that was produced by Phil Spector.
That's right, yeah.
One of the legendary producers.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's so many stories about him. What was he like in those sessions?
Well, Phil was Mr. Spector he was the boss, really. I mean, he was in control of everything. Everyone asked what to do. Where shall I stand? Where shall I play?
So including George Harrison was asking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't. There was no co-production going on. I mean, Phil was in the control room with us all the time. You got to remember, these records were done on 8-track, so in fact they were really recorded on 6-track, because you would leave 2 tracks for the vocals and the backing vocals. You know, you wouldn't fill up the 8 tracks, because that would be the end. You know, there was no other way of continuing. So it would be 6 tracks, and the lineup on the All Things Must Pass record was 2 of everything. Really, there was 2 drummers. Ringo and Jim Gordon. It was Derek and the Dominoes became the band after. So it was Ringo, Jim Gordon, Klaus Voormann and Carl Radle on bass, 2 bass players, Bobby Whitlock on keyboards, even Gary Brooker from Procol Harum was on keyboards. Badfinger, 4 guys, Badfinger, would be strumming acoustic guitars, My Sweet Lord, around 1 microphone sitting there. And it was interesting with Badfinger, everyone was a little bit older than me, so Badfinger were the same age, about 20 or something, whereas everyone else were kind of like 27, 28.
They were signed to Apple, weren't they, I think, Badfinger?
They were, yeah.
Prodigies of the
No
Beatles,
matter what. And Mal Evans was walking around with the tape of No Matter What, that single, you know, no matter what you are. And he kept wanting to mix it or do some vocals, and while they were working in one studio, you know, 2 o'clock in the morning, Mal would say to Phil McDonald, the engineer, say, "Hey, can I go in the other studio and just do some vocals with Badfinger, take John with me?" So one of the first things I did was recording some vocals on Badfinger, No Matter What. You know, and he'd bring the tape. So yeah, the lineup of the Phil Spector record was huge. You know, there was lots of people. There was horns going on. Bobby Keys, Jim Price were in the back room playing trumpet, saxophone, and it was all recorded in one go, with the reverbs as well. I mean, all the reverbs and tape echo. So there would be in those days, all you had was either an echo chamber or an echo plate. And you had tape delays, so you would run a tape and it would be fed into the tape machine, and you'd listen to the replay, so it would be slightly delayed. And if the tape was run slow, it would be a longer delay, more spacious. And you'd have 2 or 3 of these machines going at the same time, and they would always have to be going. So when it came to the end, you had to spool them back. And
so you had to be really there in your brain the whole time. Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah, and there were long sessions. I mean, you know, 2 in the afternoon till 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. I mean, really, every session would end daylight. It would end when the morning people would come in. Everyone, we'd be up all night and people would come in all fresh, smelling of aftershave, and you know, and we'd be all kind of bleary-eyed, having been there for 16 hours, you know.
And George was going through his Hare Krishna phase then, wasn't he?
That's right, yeah.
I think you told me he was sitting in the corner chanting Hare Krishna sometimes.
That's right, yeah. George had the long hair and the beard. Krishna people would come in, you know. Krishna people would come in with food, with, you know, and share all the food with us and lay it out and things. I don't think we really had joss sticks burning, but George would have a little bean bag with his beads in, and when we were doing a playback, everyone would come in and be smoking cigarettes and drinking and stuff, and George would be sitting in the corner going, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. And you go, who's that whispering, you know? And it was George there doing that, you know.
So how did that differ working with George from working with John and Yoko? Because you worked on was it the first John and Yoko album, the Plastic Ono Band album?
That's correct, yeah, with the
in fact, I didn't
Working
show,
Class Hero.
I meant to show some of your records, and of course we'll do it stage by stage, but
that's the one.
That one there, is it?
That's it, yeah.
Yeah. So you worked on this record.
That's right, yeah. Well, that's actually the Yoko one. If you turn it round, you'll see the picture of Yoko.
That's right, yeah.
So it's the same cover with John, that's Yoko's one, and John's one,
Yeah.
and actually on the front cover there, the two differences is that John's sitting there with Yoko, and on John's record, John's at the front
That's
and
right,
Yoko's
yeah,
against the
yeah,
tree.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was, again, it was Phil Spector. I don't think Phil quite understood what John was doing on that one. And it was the opposite to George's one. I mean, there was, George's record, there was 25, 30 people in the room. And John's record, there was just 3 or 4. There was just Ringo, Klaus Voormann, and John.
Yeah.
Either John on guitar or John on piano. Phil Spector, myself, and Phil McDonald and Yoko in the studio, in the control room recording. So when you hear it, of course, it's a sparse record. You know, it's very simple and very atmospheric, very vibey. You know, there's Working Class Hero on that record. You know, where he swears, where he says, you know, and that was a big shock to swear on the record. You know, to actually swear and record something and listen to him back, him saying fuck, it was like, oh, you can't have that.
Yeah. So how much did Yoko contribute? You know, she got a lot of bad PR over the years. Was she creative in the recording process?
She was always there, encouraging. You know, she was always either sitting next to him in the studio or, you know, sitting in the control room making comments. I don't think there were musical comments, but it was always enthusing and driving on. She'd often agree with him, of course, you know. If he said, oh, that's not very good, she'd go, no, it's not very good. Or if he said it was great, that's the one. And, you know, I couldn't imagine what it would be like without Yoko being there, actually.
It's interesting,
you know?
yeah. And then how did it differ then working with Paul when he was Wings? What was that? I'm trying to get a feel for how they were all different individually when they were recording.
Well, actually, the very first session I did with Paul was on his first solo record, which he recorded in Scotland on the 4-track. And I was a tape-op or something. It was probably just an afternoon session. But I always remember he had, there was John and Yoko, but there was also Paul and Linda, and Paul's solo record, that very first one, I can't remember what it was called. It was probably called McCartney, wasn't it? And it was recorded by himself in Scotland. And I remember they were making tea down in the studio. So this was in the big studio at Abbey Road, where the control room is upstairs and you look down to the studio, you're up above. And I remember Paul looked up and said, "Would you like a cup of tea?" to me. And I said, "Yes, please." And he said, "It's orange pekoe, is that okay?" I thought, wow, orange pekoe tea, it's going to be a bit weird, you know. And he said, "Come and get it then." And he had a teapot and things and proper china cup. And he said, "There you go." And I thought it was going to be like orange juice or something, and of course it was just normal tea. So, sorry. Paul was quite different, of course, because he was much more in control, much more musical. Linda I don't think Linda was playing at the time. By the time it got to Wings, because I worked on Red Rose Speedway a few years later as an engineer, just for a week. I think it was like 5 days, and we recorded the song High High High, and a number of tracks off that Red Rose Speedway record. And they just come back off tour. This was with the Wings band, the original Wings band, with Henry McCulloch and Denny Lane. All a bit crazy, all a bit wild, drinking, partying, late nights, late starts. You know, they would start 6 or 7 in the evening. And Paul was very much in control, you know. Paul would sit at the mixer. It was quite strange because he wouldn't actually touch the mixer, but he would encourage you, you know, you got a bit more bass, you know, a bit more bass, turn that down, you know, but he wouldn't actually physically touch it because there was always this respect at that time for the engineers, and, you know, the equipment was a little sacred, you know, it was like, oh, don't touch that, you know.
Yeah, it hadn't really got to the stage then when artists were producing their own albums, had it? It was still very much the producers made the records. Often they were in-house producers at the record company, because that's what Abbey House was, wasn't it?
That's right.
Abbey Road was. It was the in-house studio of EMI Records.
That's right. That's probably how I learned to produce, actually, because very often EMI house producers would come in, of course, and they didn't really know what they were doing. You know, they hadn't really made a record before, and they relied on the engineer to come up with the sounds and make suggestions and do the mix kind of thing. You know, very often you'll do a mix with these guys and you'll do it all yourself, you know, and you'll turn around and go, what do you think? And they go, oh, it's great. So I kind of learnt from working with those producers, you know. You learn from their mistakes kind of thing. You learn what works, what takes too much time, and that's how I suppose I advance, really, you know.
So in your advancement, you made the move from tape operator to engineer. So what's the essential difference between tape operator and engineer?
Well, the engineer, you sit at the desk, you sit
twiddling
between
the
the
knobs,
speakers. Yeah. At Abbey Road, you're known as the balance engineer, so you create the balance of what's under the instruction of the producer, of course. So the difference is that you're in control of the session, you're in control of the sound. You talk to the artist. You know, sometimes the tape op wouldn't talk to the artist, you know, wouldn't have any reason to, really.
Yes.
So yeah, when you become an engineer, you're in the front line, and with that comes responsibility, of course, because you know you have to make it sound not just good but special. You know, you have to. I always thought, for me, I'd always try and make a sound that no one had heard before. You know, I'd always make an acoustic guitar like the best acoustic guitar sound you've ever heard. And how do you do that? You know, you learn from your mistakes. You know, you use different microphones, the distance where you place the microphone.
So this is an important part of you emerging then. You wanted to create something, as you say, unique that no one had done before.
Yeah. And that probably came from my thing of electronic music, of being a lot more adventurous, you know, and listening to avant-garde music or electronics and things. So yeah, I was always open to unusual sounds, or making usual things sound unusual, I suppose. Yeah. Sometimes I'd succeed, sometimes it'd be disaster, you know.
And according to the notes you gave me, the first album or the first band that you worked with where you were engineer was Pink Floyd on their Metal album. It's quite a step to go from tape operator to a band, even though they weren't as huge as they were later, they still had a big status at the stage of the Metal album.
That's right.
So how did that happen? How did you get that promotion?
Well, I'd actually engineered a few things. I'd done Roy Harper. I'd worked a lot with Roy Harper in that first year, second year, and Kevin Ayers as well. They were Black Hill bands, and the Floyd were kind of friends with them, or everyone was. The Floyd had been in the studio. I also worked as a tape op on the first Syd Barrett album, which, the second Syd Barrett album was called Barrett, that was produced by Roger Waters and David Gilmour.
Okay, so you
and
worked
so
with them, yeah.
we knew each other. I knew,
Yeah.
you know, we knew each other. We'd worked together before. And how that came about was that the session started at Abbey Road, and I was the tape op. The band was a bit untogether. They were still rehearsing the song, or they had lots of small sections that were called Nothing. Nothing Part 1, Nothing Part 2, Nothing Part 3. This was all recorded on 8-track at Abbey Road. So what happened is that they filled up all the 8 tracks, obviously, with all their ideas, and then we went to Air Studios, which had a 16-track, and we would copy the 8 tracks to the 16, which gave us another 8 tracks to fill up with different sounds, different effects, and the vocals. You know, vocals, when you're limited tracks, you find that the vocals usually happen at the end for some reason, but often there's backing vocals and parts and things which need to be everything on their individual track. So yeah, so when we got to Air Studios, which was 16-track and a different type of equipment and mixer, Peter Bown, who was the balance engineer, I went as the tape op. He kind of got a bit bored and said, oh, I can't work this equipment, you know, it's all different to Abbey Road. You just carry on, you know. So he went back and went home and left me there for 2 weeks with the Floyd, and we filled up those other 8 tracks, you know, with guitars, voices, sounds, crazy things, experiment stuff, and thank you Pink Floyd, they gave me a credit on the record. Yeah,
and it's kind of it's a wonderful thing, isn't it? A band that kind of already has quite a big status, a lot of success. They will give someone that hasn't really done the job before or hardly done it, they give them a chance.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that. It's great. Yeah.
So what was Syd like? You know, Syd, obviously, it's well documented his deterioration in a bit later. But when you did that second solo album, was he fairly together?
Not fairly together, no. He was still, he had songs and he was singing. You know, he could get through from start to finish of the song with the lyrics. He was playing. There was various musicians that David Gilmour brought in, a drummer, I can't remember who was playing on that record. So he was kind of together, yeah.
Yeah.
But later I worked with him on the last sessions, which was, I think it was about 1974, I think.
They were never released, were they?
No, and that was never released. That was Syd on his own.
Yeah.
The idea was to make an album in a week. On the Monday, all the equipment arrived. So on the Monday, he was going to play guitar. On the Tuesday, he was going to play the drums. On the Wednesday, he was going to play the bass. Thursday, he was going to do the keyboards. On Friday, he was going to sing. And of course, we never got further than the guitar, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was a bit out there at that time. I mean, you couldn't really communicate with him, you know. He kind of would drift off, would leave the studio. I don't think any of the songs were finished. Well, they weren't really songs, really. They were just 12-bar blues on the guitar kind of thing, which he never got through to. He only got to the 10th bar, I think. Yeah, so it was sad, really.
He's a real casualty. Were the rest of Floyd, did you feel they were supportive of him as far as they could be?
On that second album, yes, they were. Yeah, they were frustrated, you know, and they didn't quite know what to put on there or how to. They were grateful that they could get a complete song, you know, through to the end. Yeah, they were supportive, but frustrated at the same time.
Yeah, you told me this story about when Floyd were doing "Wish You Were Here." You want to tell me that story you told me on the phone about
the Wish You
about the strange person at the back of the studio.
That's right. Yeah. During "Wish You Were Here," which I actually started recording, I did the first sessions on it because Abbey Road had a new studio. They had Studio 3, which was newly equipped with Neve mixer and new equipment, and the Floyd were the first to use it. And so I actually recorded some of the backing track for China on Your Crazy Diamond. And then I carried on with, I think, a Roy Harper record in the other studio, in Studio 2. And the Floyd had a little bar at the back of the studio. They would have a fridge with some beers in. And because I knew them, you could sneak in and take a beer from the back of from the fridge there. And one night I went in there, and there's a few people in the room. There's probably 8 people, I don't know, girlfriends, roadies and things. And Roger was out there singing, Dave was at the mixer, and the tape stopped, and Roger said, who's that at the back of the studio there? And I thought he meant me. I said, it's okay, Roger, it's okay if I take a beer. And Roger said, no, not you, John, the guy standing next to you. And there was this this chap, kind of bald head, little plump, and in a dirty raincoat, Mac, with a carrier bag, with like his supermarket plastic bag. And Dave looked up, stood up and said, is that you, Sid? And I thought, oh, bloody hell, it is, it's Sid. And I left the room, and all these people were there, and Peter James, who was the tape op, came running out and said, did you see that? That was Sid Barrett there. Yeah. So that story of Sid turning up when they were recording Shine On You Crazy Diamond is absolutely true.
Yeah. So sad, because he obviously wanted somehow to be involved or see what was going on, yet couldn't really contribute anymore. Yeah. Yeah. Did you at the stage of Medal, did you realise how big the Floyd could get?
No, but I wanted them to be. I mean, they were the top band. I mean, yeah. I didn't think they would be big on a commercial level, more on the music, on the, what could I say, the exploratory nature of the music is what attracted me to them, I didn't think they would sell 50 million records, Yeah. It was always experimenting, it was always trying, new sounds and new ideas and things.
Because I read somewhere that at one time they were trying to create tracks by not playing musical instruments, just doing anything else, bashing pieces of wood together or what, but not actually using musical instruments. Did you experience that at all?
I did, yeah. Some of those sessions we did, try and make a drum kit up out of aerosol cans, like pss, 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 and tuned beer bottles, bop, 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 bop. And wine glasses, of course. And on Dark Side of the Moon, I think there's a little wine glass orchestra where you fill the glass up and you run the edge around the glass and your finger around the glass and it resonates. And if you get the right amount of water, and you can tune it, And interesting enough, of course, in those days there weren't any tuners. We didn't have tuners. Like they have now. They have, you have a needle and you can see what pitch it is. I mean, it was all done by ear to the piano. It's like, give me a C, dong, 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 and everything was tuned to the piano,
And you actually did contribute to a track on the Dark Side of the Moon, didn't you?
I told you that as well.
That's why I'm asking. It's interesting.
Well, it's funny because I work with Pink Floyd. Everyone seems to think I've worked on Dark Side of the Moon, and I actually recorded the footsteps. Well, I think I recorded the footsteps on the Run. I think it's called a section of Dark Side of the Moon where there's the sound of someone running and panting. And basically, what happened is that I think Alan Parsons, who did all the record and everything, he'd gone off to the dentist or was away or something, and I had to take over the session, and basically it was Peter James, the tape op, with his clogs on, running on this wooden floor, and we were recording it. It was just Nick Mason in the studio, because Nick would do all those crazy things, sound effects and things. They'd let Nick do that. And so, yeah, I recorded Pete's running, his footsteps, and I was interviewed by a journalist and told them the same story. They said, "Oh, did you record something on Dark Side of the Moon?" I said, "Yeah, I recorded those footsteps." And then he went away and interviewed Alan Parsons and phoned me up and said, "Alan says he recorded those footsteps." And I'm lying. And I said, well, I don't know. I recorded them. Whether they used them, whether my footsteps are on the record or not, I don't know. But it's just a trivial thing, you know. It's only because it's Dark Side of the Moon. Everything, every little, like Beatles, every little trivia detail becomes really important, you know.
Yeah. But you must have felt at this stage, you know, working with the Floyd, being the engineer on Metal, you must have felt, and getting a bit involved with the latter albums, that your career was really taking off. Did you not feel that, you know, wow, this is really going somewhere?
Yeah, but you had to remember your place at Abbey Road. I mean, even though I was an engineer, it wasn't. It was a slow transition. So, for instance, at Abbey Road, you would work with the Pink Floyd, maybe stay up late, do a week of sessions or something, or you work with Edgar Broughton Band, or it'd be rock and roll like Mott the Hoople or something. But Monday morning, 9 o'clock, you were back being a tape op on a classical session, or you'd be put in your place. It's like, you know, you're not engineering every single day. You know, you were still on tape ops pay, and you were still.
So you're on a salary, basically.
I was on a salary.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was a factory worker. I had to clock in and clock out, and overtime after 5:30. You know, after 5:30, you could charge overtime.
So if you worked at 8 in the morning, you thought, whoopee, I'm earning a few bob here.
Absolutely. The longer the session went, the more money you could double, triple your wages by working on a Floyd session or a Roy Harper session that would go until 8 in the morning, because, you know, at the end of the week, your pay packet would be tripled.
And who was making these decisions then, where you would work? It was just somebody higher up the
in
scale,
the office, yeah.
In the office,
and very often you could choose yourself. You know, there would be sessions, and, you know, obviously there was favourite people were always put on the same session.
Yeah.
But like, for instance, the Floyd, I saw it in the diary and said, oh, I'll do that, and put your name down, you know, and things. And the interesting thing, just going back to the Beatles and the solo records, is that when I started at Abbey Road, a lot of the tape ops didn't want to work with the Beatles because the vibe wasn't very good, you know, through the White Album and the Let It Be stuff. You worked very late, you know, you were meant to be there at 2 in the afternoon to start. Sometimes they didn't turn up till 8 in the evening, 9 in the evening. And then they'd want to work till 9 o'clock in the morning, and of course you hadn't slept for 24 hours. And so it was strange, because when I started, you know, a lot of the tape ops and engineers didn't want to work with the Beatles because they didn't feel they were respected, or they didn't, you know, they would work long hours with no thanks kind of thing, or no credit.
Yeah.
I think if you read the Jeff Emmerich book, he talks about that, you know.
So your big break, in one way, was from Bill Nelson, because he was the first person that said he wanted you to produce Be-Bop DeLuxe.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd mixed Axe Victim, which was Be-Bop DeLuxe's first record. So Bill came in, I think we mixed it in a weekend, actually, and again there was an EMI house producer who wasn't very good or didn't take much notice, and Bill wasn't really satisfied. And Bill came in by himself on a Saturday morning with the tapes, which were recorded at Air Studios, very good recording. We mixed the whole album, Axe Victim, which is the one with the skeleton guitar on the front. And he then went off and did another album with Roy Thomas Baker called Futurama, which he wasn't really happy with, because Roy Thomas Baker was just produced Queen, you know, was quite domineering towards Bill. And slowly, you know, this is the third album for the band, so they were going up the ladder, and he said, hey, I'd really like to produce this with John Leckie at Abbey Road, you know. So, yeah, that was the first record, and it was fantastic, actually. I don't think, you know, by that time I was very confident of being able to run a session, take on a band, and, you know, get a great sound, see the whole process through from recording the backing tracks through to the mixing. So I was quite confident that I could do this, you know.
Yeah, so I'm asking a few basic questions for people that don't necessarily know how it works. So what is the difference between a producer and a balance engineer?
Well, quite a lot, because the
No,
producer,
I realised that,
the
but,
producer is responsible for the whole record. Really, he's responsible for the choice of songs, the performance. You know, very often, you know, it's said, like, if you're an engineer and you make a comment about the recording, like, about the performance, like you say, oh, that's good, but it's a bit slow, or oh, the guitar's a bit out of tune. That's a producer's comment. So an engineer, theoretically, would never say the guitar's out of tune or the singing's not in tune or something, because that's a performance producer's idea. It's his job to make that correct, you know. The producer is someone who sees the project through from start to finish, I'd say, who's responsible for the sound of the record and getting the optimum performance out of the band, you know. And
you got that sort of knowledge and confidence by watching other producers over your time as working there.
Yeah, you learn what works, what doesn't work, takes a lot of time. You know, a lot of people have crazy ideas, and it can take hours to come to exercise a crazy idea and come up with and realise it's not working. So you might waste 6 hours. You know, I mean, sometimes you might waste days in the studio pursuing something that is not going to work. So you get to learn those things. You learn from your mistakes and other people's mistakes. You know.
See, it's interesting because you were saying earlier you were never really a musician. You didn't strum your guitar at home or anything. So you were a non-musician who was producing top musicians. How does it happen?
How did I get away with it?
Well, that's the kind of question I want to ask you.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it never really occurred to me, and no, I've never really been in trouble over that. I've never really been in sometimes I've been in a sticky situation, like, you know, people naming chords and that kind of thing. But, you know, you can describe a chord, or it's to do with communication, how you describe chords or sections in the music and sounds and things. And also from experience, you know, I knew how to handle bands, you know, musicians that were a bit wobbly or not very good, or, you know, most bands consist of 4 blokes with very big egos, you know, and they all are desperate to succeed. They're always, and, you know, there's obviously a love-hate relationship within the band of, you know, what they feel towards each other. And it's like a bit like being a bit of a psychiatrist, really, or you know, being able to make everyone happy, you know. Because that you know you've got to get a result from the performance, whether it's to do with a vocalist or a drummer or something, you know.
You see, I've known you. I don't know how many years we've known each other, but a few years now. And you know, you've always come across as a very calm person. And I can imagine, I've never been in the studio with you, but I can imagine you being very good when there's differences and things, just helping people to calm it out. Yet you've got other producers like I can't think of one now, but there's some very volatile producers who are the bosses, as you say, and they're kind of almost dictating to the bands. Yeah. But your style seems to be the other way up, insofar as you're almost like the 5th or 6th member of the band, and you're, as you say, also the psychiatrist, the peacemaker, the one that's trying to bring together the best out of some disparate parts at times.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know. You know how I do it. It's strange because actually, when you listen to some records, I mean, I used to get it with engineers really, because you know, particularly at Abbey Road sometimes, where I was, you know, in a complex where there was a number of studios and a number of engineers working, you know, in other studios as well, and the sound they made somehow. I'm not talking about the producer, but the sound that an engineer could make of guitar, bass, drums and vocals kind of reflected on their personality. So you would get some some engineers where the sound would be very bright and shrill and what could you say, over pumped up, and then when you met the person, that's how they were.
Yeah,
and you would get other
interesting.
people, other engineers, and the sound would be much more formal and in place, and everything would be neat and tidy and that kind of thing in the sonic picture I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And then when you met that engineer, someone like Bill Price or something, that's how they were. You know, that was their personality. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I seem to have done okay from just being myself, really.
Yeah.
You know, just being myself. Sometimes you have to go out on a limb and, you know, if there's pressure from the record company, for instance, on being commercial, on creating singles, hit singles, you know, that's what all record companies want, are hit singles, you know. So sometimes you know, you have to, what's the word, crack the whip, and, you know, sometimes there's a time factor or a financial thing. You've got to finish by 6 o'clock Friday afternoon. You know you've got to get the record finished by a certain day. So you have to be strong. You have to be. You are the authority. You know, you are paid to complete a record up to, you know, to a certain standard within a certain time. With these musicians, you've agreed on those songs. You know. Usually it's down to the song, you know, it's down to the song and the abilities of the musicians, you know.
Yeah, we'll come on more in detail to that later. But so you produced XTC, and then after that you left Abbey Road. So XTC, you had a fondness for them, didn't you? You got on very well with them.
Yeah.
Because they're known as not always very easy to get on with, but you seem to again bring the disparate parts together.
Yeah, I loved working with XTC, and it's funny because I started off probably on the strength of Be-Bop DeLuxe. They were Be-Bop DeLuxe fans, but I produced their first single EP at Abbey Road, and then when it came to do the album, which is called White Music, they wanted to record it at the Manor Studios, which belonged to Virgin Records, and they were signed to Virgin Records. So I went to the boss of Abbey Road and said, hey, this band want me to produce their album at the Manor, isn't that great? He said, oh, you can't do it. He says, you can't do it, you're employed by EMI, and you can't go off and work for another company. I said, but charge them, pay me, I'll, you know, whatever it costs, you know, they're willing to pay. No, you can't do it. If you do it, you're fired. And so I did it during my holiday. I had 2 weeks annual holiday, and I didn't tell anyone, and went off to the Manor and did this record with them. And then, funny enough, when the second album happened, Go 2 with XTC, we were going to record at the Townhouse, which was the new Virgin studio in Shepherd's Bush. And we were going to be the first session in there. XTC, their favourite band, was in the first session. And we turned up, and the studio wasn't ready. The mixer had blown up or something, and so we couldn't record there. And so I phoned up Abbey Road and said, hey, is Studio 3 available for the next couple of weeks? Yeah, sure. So we ended up recording it back at Abbey Road. Yeah. But that is the reason why I left Abbey Road, really, was because they had this funny thing where they wouldn't hire me out. I couldn't work for other companies. I could if I brought them to Abbey Road, but I couldn't, for instance, go off to the Townhouse and work for Virgin Records or, you know.
So even when you were producing, you were still on a basic salary there?
I was, yeah. I was a producer. In fact, the week I left Abbey Road, I had 3 albums in the top 20, which was XTC, Be-Bop DeLuxe, and the Adverts. And I had the Adverts No Time to Be 21 in the top 20.
Wow.
You know, so I had a top 20 single and 3 albums in the top 30 album charts.
No percentage.
And and Abbey Road still wouldn't give me a job. You know, they said, well, no, you can't go off and work for another company. You know. Huh. And I said, well, give me some EMI artists to produce, you know. And, well, you've got one. You've got Be-Bop DeLuxe, you know. I mean, this is on the 5th album I'd done with them, you know.
Yeah. So how was, you mentioned the Adverts, and of course they were one of the early punk bands. First single was, I think, was it One Called Wonder or Three Called Wonder, the first?
One Called Wonders,
Wonder,
Bored Teenagers.
Bored Teenagers, that's right. No Time to Be 21. There was some very basic songs, but very catchy songs.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole punk attitude thing was very different and was in a way very anti-establishment bands, or like the Pink Floyd, who, and certainly prog rock was really kind of reviled by the whole punk breakthrough. So how was that for you as a producer, kind of coming from working with really big bands to a band like the Adverts, who's, you know, I still know, have some contact with TV Smith Tim, and he's a great guy, but he's nothing like the musician of some of the more sophisticated bands. So did you enjoy that, the working in a basic way?
I enjoyed the energy of them. I enjoyed their the attitude and the energy, and you know, the fact that it was rock and roll. It was raw. You know, it was like people that you know were putting their whole being into the playing, into the music. You know. Sometimes it was a bit frustrating, you know, if drummers fall over each other and, you know, things don't, you know, you can always tune them up. You can always make sure they're in tune and go for a good take, you know. And the Adverts, surprisingly enough, were great. I mean, that was recorded at Abbey Road. It's funny, a punk band recording at Abbey Road Studios, you know. But yes, we did that record in Studio 3. Gay Advert was the bass player. She never made a mistake, you know. She drove all the. If you listen to the records, she's a driving force behind every track. There's a bit of production, you know. I mean, the Adverts album, I was a bit disappointed years later. I thought, God, it sounds too polished, you know, because all the vocals are double tracked.
Interesting.
And those kind of things, and you know, I much prefer the stiff stuff, which was kind of rough and ready and. You know, what Nick Lowe was doing as a producer for Stiff was much better than what I was doing, you know. Maybe that's because of Abbey Road or because of who I am, you know.
And then famously you produced the first Pill single.
I didn't produce it. I was meant to produce it. You know, the record company asked me to produce it. And I went in as a producer, but I ended up engineering it, really. I never got credit. No one knows I did it. I mean, only the people that were there know that I did it. In fact, Jar Wobble doesn't even remember that I did it, but I did, and I was there at Advision Studios, and we did that Public Image song. Keith Levine wanted his amplifier in the control room, you know, and you know, he said, "Oh, where are you going to put my guitar?" I said, "Well, out there in the corner." And I put a screamer. No, fuck that. I want to be in the control room next to you. I want to hear what's going on. So there's me working in the control room, and he's got this deafening guitar. And in the end, I think John said to him, he says, "Keith, stop messing about. Get it out there. You know, move it to where he wants it. Do it properly. You know."
You see, the impression I got from the early Pill sessions, it was very kind of shambolic and disorganised. And Jar Wobble had never played in a band before. I think he was 17 years old. 17. Just got a bass player, and he does that opening line in Pill, which the first Pill single, Public Image Limited. It's a great
it's a
great bass line,
energy and everything, and the drums. I mean, my brief on that when they came in, they were like, right, we want the highest highs. And we want the lowest lows. We want the lowest bass and the highest top, you know. And so don't mess it up, you know. And they were very aggressive. I mean, very aggressive. Yeah, they were aggressive, rude and aggressive. You know, I was a long-haired hippie at the time. You know, I was hair down here and loon pants. You know.
And Wobble stole your wallet, didn't he?
Yeah, we don't talk about that. There was all sorts of stuff, drinking and. Let's say spilt beer and food fights. I think they got banned from every studio in London because they would just trash it and, you know, order fish and chips and throw it everywhere. Yeah. But anyway, that was all then.
I'm just looking it through. You know, time is finite. We'll do a part 2 of this program. We're not going to cover your whole career in one part, but there's so many bands that you produced here that are so fascinating. So you worked with the Skids. Who came out, a Scottish band that came out of the punk movement. Wilco Johnson, who you were actually engineer on that one, but that it wasn't so much punk, but it was very energetic. It was very
That's
raw,
right.
wasn't it?
Rock and roll, yeah.
Yeah. And then Human League came out of post-punk.
That's right.
So
yeah.
you were very much involved in the kind of the movement of where the new music was going.
Yeah.
It must have been an exciting time.
New wave, yeah.
It was new
cool.
wave, yeah.
We've got Magazine in there as well, actually, which was
Magazine, that's right.
which was a great record. I mean, even if I'm really proud of the Magazine Real Life record, because I think if you play it today, it sounds like a new band. It sounds like a band that's recorded and performing today, you know, with guitar and electronics, you know. Great drums, weird voice, weird lyrics, very colourful, you know. So I'm proud of the Magazine record.
Yeah, and it kind of it really goes back to what you were saying earlier about how you wanted to create sounds that were different as a producer. This must have given you the opportunity to do that in a big way.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. There was all that opportunity to drench things in reverb if you wanted, or to make them ultra dry, you know, and contrast, and you know, especially with the electronics and the guitar that doesn't sound like a guitar, you know. I mean, I think Simple Minds, Charlie Burchill and John McGeoch were the new wave guitarists that, with the electronics and the synthesizers, you know, they were competing with that. And so the guitar sounds were almost electronic themselves, you know, with the limited equipment that we had at the time, you know.
Yeah, we forget that, because at that time, how many tracks were available for recording? You mentioned 8 tracks earlier on. How many tracks did it got to at that time?
It got to 24, or
24,
sometimes 16, you know, sometimes only 16. But I think it was more or less 24. But you know, it's funny because now on Pro Tools on the computer, you've got an infinite number of tracks, and a lot of, you know, if I was recording a band like XTC or Magazine now, I would probably have 50 tracks. You know, I mean, it's crazy, really. I mean, you set your own discipline to it, but because you have lots of tracks, you tend to use them. Like you put ambient mics, you record a guitar, and you might have 2 or 3 or 4 stereo ambient mics at different distances, just in case you need them and want to play with them, you know, which you could never do if you were on tape, because you'll never have the track availability. And on tape, you always wanted one more track. If you were on 24 track, you always needed 25.
Yeah.
And even when you got up to 48 track, because later in the late 80s and stuff, you could run 2 24 tracks in sync, so you'd have 48 tracks. You always needed 49.
Yeah. So I think we've got about 5 minutes left on this part 1. So something inside you was changing, because you, I think, were getting into meditation, and you were looking at alternative lifestyle, and you had a sabbatical period. So what was happening in you leading up to that?
I think I was. What could I say? I was getting older. I was 30, 32. I'd been married 10 years or so, or 12 years I've been married. We got married when I was 21, you know, just as I started at Abbey Road. And we're still married very happily. And things were changing in my life, and maybe I wasn't working as much as I used to. The energy had changed. The technology had changed, you know. It was moving, as I say, there was more electronics, more sophisticated equipment, and you know, I suppose I was a bit more of a rock and roller at the beginning and liked the simplicity of things. So I discovered I'd always been aware of what could I say, Indian spirituality, Buddhism. I think I'd been I wouldn't say studying, but I'd been aware of Buddhism since the 60s. I'd been a vegetarian since I met George Harrison, actually. I've been a vegetarian since the early 70s. And things kind of come together, and in London there was a movement called the Rajneesh movement, and it was, people say it was a cult, whatever that means, but it was a group of friends who devoted themselves to Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who's later called Osho, and it was just, it was very attractive at the time because all the people that I'd met, I felt a connection to, and there was a commune, there was a feeling of living together,
Yeah.
which I'd done in the 60s when I first left home. We all lived together in a big house in Westbourne Grove, and there was a bit of a communal feel, and so I was very keen on this lifestyle and spent all the time I could doing the meditations at the commune in Suffolk, and eventually about 1982 I think we sold the house and moved myself and the family to the commune there, and lived there for a year or two, and was totally devoted to it, devotee I suppose.
And you didn't really miss the music side?
I didn't. In fact, I did all I could to avoid the music side because there was a lot of music and things involved with the meditation and the life there. And I purposely tried to avoid it. And of course I got drawn into recording and doing PA and, you know, running around and helping musicians, you know. And I met lots of great people there who I'm still, you know, great friends with. And so yeah, I'm very grateful for that, and things moved on. I mean, did it change me? Did I get enlightened? I don't know.
Well, it was around that time I met you, so
that's right.
I didn't know you before that, but you've been always, as I said earlier, you've always been pretty laid back, the John Leckie that I know, so whether you were extra laid back after that, I don't know. Anyway, we need to kind of finish what we call part one now.
Okay.
So if you're watching this on television or the internet, there is a part two which is worth seeking out, and if you can't find it on television, then you can find it on the cherryred.tv website. So thank you for watching part one with John Leckie, and we'll see you again in part two.